All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews with Justin Clark. How's it going?
It's going great, Cory. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Awesome.
You can always tell the days I don't know how to introduce the show.
That's fine. That's fine. This is number 31, isn't it?
It is so, yeah.
31. All right, cool. Well, tonight's episode is kind of a little bit of a detour. We're going back to some of our roots to talk a little bit about skepticism and atheism and stuff like that. So tonight's book is Respectful Atheism by Thomas Sheridan, A Perspective on Belief in God and Each Other. Sheridan was a professor emeritus of the Departments of Mechanical Engineering and Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. The former University of Noam Chomsky. So he kind of was there at the same time Chomsky was. Not that they probably knew each other or anything like that, but that's where MIT was Chomsky's old home. Right. And this book was published by Prometheus Books, which is the publishing company that was created by Paul Kurtz back in the 1970s. Okay. Paul Kurtz is the sort of founder of modern secular humanism. We've done a book of his on here yet, but we probably should. Respectable Atheism, which most of the atheism isn't, huh? I think that's fair. Like, I think to a certain degree. The atheism movement. Yes. Yeah. Good clarification there. I agree with you completely. So I bought this book. I saw this book when I was on vacation at a really amazing bookstore called Book People in Austin, Texas. And I was like, this book looks great. I didn't buy it there. I ended up buying it another time. And I read it. I read it in a couple of days. I think it's my overall thought on the book is that it's a decent mixed bag. I think there's good stuff in it. I don't think there's anything horrible in it. Like it's not like objectionable. Nothing in it's like horrible or objectionable. It's just a book that feels very, I don't know how to describe it. It feels unfinished. It's almost like he needed a co-writer to kind of come in and like kind of spread out the text. Right. Because apparently this book is based on a class that he would teach at, I think, MIT or some other university on like sort of respectful atheism as like a class. And that makes perfect sense. So like when you know that context, the book reads very much like it's basically his notes for the class. Right. Okay. So it's very like, I'm going to tell you about this person. I'm going to give you the basic Wikipedia description of this person. I'm going to tell you about another person. Then I'm going to give you the basic Wikipedia description of it. Now, I know that sounds insulting, but he literally does cite Wikipedia quite a bit in the book. Okay, interesting. Which, again, I got no beef with Wikipedia, although I would say if you're going to be using a online encyclopedia, especially philosophy, you should be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Right. But anyway, yeah. Or you could I don't know, you could use some of the primary sources that the Wikipedia pages uses. Right. And he does some of that. But the big thing about the book is it's essentially like if you didn't have time to read certain books, this is the book for you. Like he basically explains in 2 pages John Gray's 7 Types of Atheism, which is a book I've considered reading and considered doing on this show. Okay. But I think that John Gray is such a scumbag that I can't I think that his politics are retrograde. I think his view of atheism is nonsense. So I was like, he explains basically John Gray's book in 2 pages. And I'm like, great. I don't have to read that book now. Cliff Notes on Atheism, the book. Pretty much, dude. Like, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. And it kind of reads like that. There's literally a chapter where in multiple pages, it's literally him just like recreating a Karen Armstrong like editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and then a Richard Dawkins editorial in the Wall Street Journal, and like comparing them together. Okay, it's just like it is a book about big picture questions, clearly written by a science person who needs someone to come in and teach him how to be more of a humanist, like in a small H sense, right? In the sense of like how to write. Teach him how to be more of a human. Like teaching him how to be more of a like a writer, because I think the writing is pretty boring. It's fine. I read this book in 2 days. Like, it was pretty easy to read. There are facts that he gets wrong. So, like, for example, like Victor Stenger, who was a big sort of leader in the new atheist movement, he wrote God, the Failed Hypothesis.
Yeah, I've got a couple of his books, actually.
And I've read a couple of his books too. And he basically says he's still alive when he's not. He died like almost 10 years ago.
Oh, geez,
there's like certain big facts. Like, for example, when people talk about Stephen Jay Gould and they talk about the non-overlapping magisteria, the book that they are citing is called Rocks of Ages with an S. It's a pun.
Not Rock of Ages.
Not Rock of Ages.
Which is a play or a musical.
Musical, right. Or Rock of Ages, which is sort of a biblical phrase, right? And he makes the same mistake in the book where he calls it Rock of Ages when it's actually called Rocks of Ages because Gould was a paleontologist. It's a clever pun. So there's just like these little things that I catch. And I was reading through the book. I'm like, okay, Vic Stenger is definitely dead. And I'm like looking it up. I'm like, oh yeah, he died in like 2015 or whatever. Yeah. So I write that in the notes. I put a little S next to Rock on Rocks of Ages. There's just certain things I'm like, this book.
Why didn't his editor catch this stuff?
Because, and part of it is, so Prometheus Books is no longer independent, sadly to say. It was independent for many, many, many years. But Prometheus Books is now owned by Rowman and Littlefield, which is another book company, which is a smaller book company. They do a lot of history books. They do a lot of like academic publishing. They own Prometheus Books now, or at least they own the print, the brand.
Right.
And which is a little disappointing that it's no longer independent, but it's just, it is the nature of the beast. I mean, and it seems like the brand itself, like the publishing company itself, is moving more and more away from these kinds of books and just doing more like generic stuff. But anyway.
So when was this published?
This book was put out in, I believe, 2021. Yes.
Oh, so not that very long ago. Jeez.
So it's fairly new. And so this book is essentially another sort of regurgitation of the God debate and with sort of his own little flourishes. And I will get into where I think the book really succeeds and then and I've already sort of talked about where I don't think the book succeeds.
Okay.
So he notes on I think the first page, he kind of defines what a respectful atheism would look like.
Okay.
And I think it's quite good. But basically, so he says, a respectful atheist recognizes and appreciates that different people have different beliefs that they have come to because of family, community, education, contemplation, or other aspects of their experience. A respectful atheist acknowledges everyone's right to their own beliefs so long as they do not take destructive action against others who believe differently. So that's pretty good. I think that's a pretty general statement. And I think that's right. He goes through essentially the history of philosophy and lays out sort of the concept of God and how it developed and how, he talks about how the sort of monotheistic God was in many ways according to because the thing is he doesn't bring enough of his own to the material. It's a lot of him kind of sharing what other people think about this stuff.
Okay.
Which is fine. It's all right. It's just, it's not as, I just expected this book to be a lot more a critique of the new atheists.
Right. And that's not what it is.
And it's not what it is. Which is kind of unfortunate because I think that would be a more interesting book than this one is.
Right.
So where am I at here? Let's see. But he talks about sort of the development of, So he sort of talks about the development of gods and how we go from the Egyptian gods. And then eventually in Egyptian history, you have the one God, right? The sun God. That we go from, e pluribus unum, out of many goes one. And, and he talks about how a really interesting idea that comes from Julian Jaynes, who was, I think, a psychologist. And it's this idea that the gods sort of reflected the growing notion of the self. That as human beings became more intelligent and more, for lack of a better word, civilized, I guess, in terms of building civilizations, we grew a sense of what we knew as the self or the I. that
Right.
knowing ourselves as independent individual people with our own sort of ideas and consciences, that sort of develops along with religion. That's quite interesting, I think.
Yeah. It's an interesting perspective.
It's an interesting perspective. But again, it's not one that he holds. So it's like
he's just writing about what somebody else said.
He's kind of writing what other people have said, which is fine.
Sure.
And like, that's what good scholarship is kind of going back to what other people have said and sort of putting your spin on it. But he doesn't really put a ton of spin on it. It's more just kind of regurgitating the information for you.
He's teaching class.
He's teaching a class. And so, he talks about, the idea of the development of different philosophical traditions and how, the developments of sort of religious skepticism. I think in terms of learning the history of like skepticism and free thought and atheism is kind of much better handled in other books. Like, so for example, I think Corliss Lamont's The Philosophy of Humanism, I think outlines a lot of this stuff a lot better. And Lamont also sort of gives his own spin on some of this. So he'll talk about how some people feel, but doesn't often say like, well, here's what I agree with on this, or here's what I disagree with on this. He doesn't do a lot of that. So
right.
it's
so
more
what do
just,
we know about his perspective in any way?
it kind of not much other than he sort of describes himself because he came from a cultural Christian background. He describes himself sort of as a Christian atheist, which is fine. And I've heard other people say that. So like Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, kind of identifies himself that way. Other people have identified themselves that way. Even Dawkins, to a certain extent, has actually called himself that in describing himself as sort of a Anglican atheist, and that he grew up in Anglican religion. So it's like a cultural Christianity, very much akin to people who are sort of like culturally Jewish,
right?
And which is fine. I think that's interesting. But where I think he's the most interesting part of the book is the middle part of the book, where he talks about science and talks about how do we know what we know, which I think this is where he shines, because he's like a scientist and an engineer. Right. And so the stuff that's about science and engineering is the stuff where he's like, I feel like he's most comfortable talking. And so he's really good at explaining kind of like the difference between a model and a theory, that like, differences.
Something many people need.
Yeah. Right. So like, for example, let's see here. So like, let's see, let me go back here real quick. So like, model. Yeah. So like, let's see here. Yeah. And like, some people distinguish a model from a theory, where a model is a rendering of specific relationships relevant to a theory being a statement that circumscribes some relationships within the larger, more complex reality. So like, you can have like a model, which is kind of like how you do things. And then you have a theory, which explains, it's sort of the so what. It's the broader question, if I'm understanding that right.
Yeah. Like, like, I think you got it right.
Cool. And I think the more interesting idea, and I think that it's something that like, had he had a better editor or had a co-author on this book, would have been something more interesting to go into, which is the difference between denotative truth and connotative truth.
Okay. Yeah.
So this is super interesting. And I had, as I'm much more of a political philosophy person. So sometimes when it comes to science, I am ignorant, and I apologize for that. But I never really heard it put so succinctly before. And I was like, oh yeah, that's quite good. So what is denotative and connotative truth? Denotative truth is essentially truth which conforms to the evidence. So it's like 2 + 2 is 4, water is,
gravity makes things fall.
Water is 2 parts. Is it 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen?
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty darn good. But then connotative truth is a very different thing, where it's, whereas connotation refers to the implied or suggested meaning, as with metaphor. So it's like literal truth and metaphorical truth.
Okay.
And I think this is quite interesting and important. So like many things, I can't help but bring him up this is where like Jordan Peterson like muddies the waters, but it's actually something important, which is the idea that we all live by metaphors and myths.
Right.
Whether we like it or not, and some of them don't have anything to do with the supernatural, right?
Right.
So like you and I believe in making a more equal society. That's kind of a connotative truth. We can make a denotative truth. We could probably find some studies saying, societies that have more political democracy or inequality tend to have higher life expectancy, or they tend to have better outcomes for children.
We can make the utilitarian argument.
You can make the utilitarian argument for it, but the sort of so what, why is that valuable question, that's sort of the realm of connotative truth, whereas we're making a value judgment. And so some things are not sort of purely left to reason alone. Some of them, this is why David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, said that reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. Mm-hmm. People, when they read, they kind of hear that in first blush, they go like, oh, so we should just be reasonable. No, what he's saying is that reason can take you to some truly immoral ends, right? Yeah, that's right. And so he's talking about how never let your reason be completely sort of overshadowed by your sense of compassion and empathy for other human beings. Yeah. And those are sort of base truths that we believe in that don't necessarily have like you can't put them in a beaker and like do a scientific experiment to prove
I mean, to go back to we typically talk about leftist stuff. This is where I disagree with people who call themselves like scientific socialists. Yes. And they're like, I'm socialist for materialist reasons, but that doesn't have a value judgment. That doesn't make, so you're not in favor of liberation. You're not in favor. Right. Like, what are you actually, like, what are your moral reasons? What are your ethics here?
Exactly. And I think that's where they mistake, I think, pure logic can cause the robots to take over because of the three laws, like as Asimov warns us. Absolutely right. Right. Yeah. And or if you think about, another great adage from another contemporary of Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, which is that any advanced technology, sufficiently advanced technology, is indistinguishable from magic. And so, like, there are things that people from 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, 300 years ago that would see today and would be, I think, blown away. Like, they wouldn't know how to handle it. Like, their brains couldn't handle it, in the sense that, like, if they saw us doing what we're doing, they would think that we were like little demons in a box or something. Like it's so what's important is that like we live through meanings and we live through myths, but they're not necessarily bad myths or they're not necessarily supernatural, right? Like I make a very clear distinction that I, as a sort of base assumption, my base assumption is that the supernatural doesn't exist. That's my base assumption. Yeah. And I'm happy to see evidence to the contrary. Hero of a Thousand Faces. Yeah. The Joseph Campbell shit. Yeah. Which he gets into in the book. We talk about sort of myths to live by and things like that. The problem is, and I think where I think we get awry in terms of sort of having so much respect for myths is that myths can often be completely divorced from the reality of their construction. Right. So for example, people who sort of reinterpret Jesus as this like sort of radical secular humanist type, which Sheridan talks about a writer and television presenter named Don Cupid who did this. He wrote sort of about how, religions are sort of it's the sort of Aldous Huxley like perennial philosophy thing where it's like all religions speak a shard of truth. They exist as like 1,000 points of light, in George Bush's phrase, that exist all to sort of tell us about human universals. And Jesus is sort of this like humanistic teacher. And you can certainly have that interpretation. In fact, that was one that Thomas Jefferson had. Thomas Jefferson famously literally took a knife to the Bible, little box knife to the Bible, and cut out and pasted together all the stuff that he liked, cutting out all the supernatural stuff, cutting out all the egregious stuff, and kept all the good stuff. The book was called The Faith and Moral Teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, also known today as the Jefferson Bible. I have a copy of it. Yeah. It's a little book. It's a little book. What I find quite interesting about the Bible is that like it's this like huge tome. And to be fair, like the Old Testament is significantly longer than the New Testament. The New Testament is much shorter.
Okay.
But in fairness, it's 1,000 pages or 2,000 pages of text or whatever. And Jefferson could basically get the teachings of Jesus down to a couple hundred pages.
Right. All the stuff he liked was like very, very small. All the stuff that he liked
was all very small. Yeah. Because the problem with the Bible, and I think the problem with sort of God talk in general, is that God talk can kind of be used to defend anything. So, for example, one of the greatest moral leaders of the 20th, when you get awesome metal songs based off of the Jefferson Bible. Yeah. For example, one of the greatest moral leaders of the 20th century was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Right.
I think that he was a Christian humanist in the biggest sense of the word. I think he had a liberation theology that was rooted in his view of Christianity as a liberatory force of community. Yeah. And that's how he believed in it, right? But for every person that exists, it's like Martin Luther King. There's a Jim Jones, there's a David Koresh, right? And
Pat Robertson.
There's a Pat Robertson. There's a Oral Roberts. There's a Jerry Falwell.
Yeah.
Jerry Falwell. One of my favorite quotes ever is actually about Jerry Falwell is from Christopher Hitchens, who said that Jerry Falwell, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said Jerry Falwell was so full of shit that that once it was excised of his body, he could be buried in a matchbox. Which I think is quite true, right?
Pretty hardcore.
So this is the problem of sort of using mythic language to sort of defend specific things, because at the end of the day, it can have good things and bad things.
Right.
And any political philosophy has this too, right? So we think about liberalism as a broader philosophy. At a time before, socialist movements, like the liberal tradition was a very radical tradition. The idea of, purporting your beliefs to the evidence, to freely and openly examining claims of scientific or religious nature, of sloughing off hereditary monarchies and hereditary power in service of democratic ideas. Some really radical shit. And it's stuff that is quite good and a heritage that we should build on. But at the same time, liberalism has its dark side, which is that it's sort of constant emphasis on instrumental reason. Basically, in the words of Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park, you the whole time you thought about whether you could do it, whether or not you should, right? And that emphasis of just whether we could do it rather than should do it has basically led to atomic bombs and death camps, that sort of. And so that sort of tradition, that liberal tradition, has a dark side to it too, and religion does as well. Yeah. This is why I never I don't necessarily agree with Christopher Hitchens, who said that religion poisons everything. I think I would sort of change that a little bit, and we're going to be talking about Hitch in a few weeks.
Nice.
Because I've rewritten the schedule. We're going to be doing 2 books one night where we're going to talk about God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, and we're going to talk about Reason, Faith, and Revolution by Terry Eagleton. So Eagleton wrote his book in response to Hitchens, and Terry Eagleton's a Marxist and a socialist, so he's sort of writing as this in response, and so he's a lot more sanguine about religion than Hitchens is. But I think that the way I would phrase it is, it's religion has the capacity to poison things. It certainly can, but it also has the potential to do good. And I think that's kind of like any ideology, with the exception of fascism, which is kind of shit all the way down.
Yeah.
But I think that sort of, I just think that the commitment to metaphors sometimes muddies the waters and doesn't allow us to really see life for what it is.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there's a place for both denotative and connotative truth, and those things go hand in hand. And it's a balance between the two.
I mean, if you're gonna say the way we use myths and the mythical language we use is kind of how we demonstrate our values and our reasons for doing things, then you have to have that, right?
Yeah. And I think that if we all had to every single day go through and rationally defend everything that we believed and everything that we did, we'd all go insane. right?
And you can see that like in your day-to-day experience. Like if you do a thing every day for your through your routine, right? And then one day somebody's like, why do you do it that way? You know, like you can't always necessarily defend it rationally. It's just the way you've always done things.
Right. Like sometimes it's like, I guess the lesson is with metaphors, like a lot of things, it is better in moderation. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think that what Sheridan's kind of getting to in the book is, I think has been better in some senses better articulated by Paul Kurtz, where he talks about the idea of the sort of, I think he sort of described as like sort of the poetic truth of religion, where we talk about how religious language and religious stories are often lessons about how we should live with one another or how we should not live with one another. Sometimes they're great examples of what not to do in the case of like, I don't know, Lot and his two daughters,
right.
Or, you know, like slavery or anything like that. Right. So I think that when we think about the sort of poetic nature of religion, that is, I think, in the humanist tradition as well. So like as a secular humanist myself, you know, I'm greatly moved by the writing of like, say, Carl Sagan, or I'm very moved by the poetry of Langston Hughes, or, you know, or the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. Like there's all kinds of, or the speeches of Debs, or Robert Ingersoll, like the Thomas Paine, like the writing that they have has this sort of humanist poetry to it that is quite moving and important. And I think that's worthwhile. And I think I think it's very much deeply rooted in all of us, that desire to have a sense of wonder and a sense of awe and joy about sort of existence. Right. And he gets into this when he talks about a book by another author called Reverence, where he talks about the idea of reverence as sort of a key component of life.
Yeah, that's kind of the same thing. Yeah. But although, reverence seems to have like specifically religious connotations.
It does sound like it though, right? Like that's kind of the trickier part. I'm trying to think let's see if I can find where he actually says that. But reverence is, I think, reverence here. So it was from a guy named Paul Woodruff. Woodruff defines reverence as a well-developed capacity to have certain feelings like awe, respect, and shame. Reverence, he asserts, begins with a deep understanding of human limitations and a capacity to be in awe of whatever we believe to be outside of our control, to keep us from acting like gods. So, like, it's a sense of humility. So Terry Eagleton calls it tragic humanism, as opposed to liberal humanism. So liberal humanism is the humanism that sort of believes in like big P progress, where, you know, today is the best day humanity's ever had and tomorrow's going to be even better. Like that sort of right. Steven Pinker kind of Bill Gates, Hans Rosling kind of view of the world.
Citations Needed just did a kind of a debunking episode about that.
Good.
It was very good.
And I need to catch up on that podcast. I love those guys. And they did a live stream where they talked about one of my all-time favorite DS9 episodes about Star Trek. But anyway, like the problem with like, we can have progress. I think progress is like a good thing. And well, hello. Thank you for joining us tonight. And I think your little emojis are fun. And you know, where was I going with this? It's okay to like have reverence for things, but it's also important to recognize, progress. Sorry, that's what I was talking about. So with progress, yes, we've had real progress, right? Like, for example, like there are medical advancements that allow me to live every day, you know?
Right.
There are children who never would have been born without the medical advancements we have. There are people who would die of communicable diseases without the advancements in technology and in sewage management and all of that, right?
Yeah.
You know, like one of the greatest eradicators of human misery was indoor plumbing.
Yeah.
Like there's all kinds of like public works, like those all really do create progress and they're all good things, right? But the problem is this sort of undying faith in progress, because then you can have a sense of hubris where it's like, we're going to have gene editing and there's not going to be any disease anymore. And and also like the big P progress, I see it on the left too, right? Where it's like, once we have the revolution, everything's going to be fucking wonderful.
Right.
And, we're going to get rid of all the rich people and everybody's going to love their new situation and everything's going to be great. And it's going to be bread and roses and wonderful. And it's like, no,
this is going to be work.
you missed like the fundamental lesson of Marxism, which is that the revolution is the beginning of human history,
right?
Not the culmination of it.
Yeah, that's right.
That if we were to ever truly achieve a post-scarcity society or socialist society or communist society, that would mean the true beginning of humanity.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is why I'm not an anti-civ. This is why I'm not anti-civ and not an anarcho-primitivist. Many of my comrades need good medicine. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And primitivism is essentially it's the logical conclusion to political nihilism, which we're going to talk about in a future episode about Leszek Kolakowski, which is that the left, fundamentally at its core, should not be nihilist. That we should believe in ourselves. We should believe in the capacity to change the world. We should believe, because nihilism is essentially fundamentally conservative.
Yeah.
Because if you don't think anything's going to get any better, why would you ever
do anything?
Why do anything about it?
Yeah.
So that's a component we'll talk about when we talk about Kolakowski in the future.
That'll annoy my anarcho-nihilist listeners.
And I can understand. So and I hope I'm not straw manning because that's not my intention. But because I know there's probably a version like anarcho-nihilism where it's like you've hit where there's sort of like this like tragic hope where like you've hit a place where your nihilism sort of lends you to the capacity to sort of acknowledge that you could make things better if you wanted to. I don't know. I'm trying not to straw man them, but quite frankly,
I'm not a nihilist.
I'm not either
because I don't buy it. But
I always think of I'm a huge fan of The Big Lebowski,
mm-hmm.
and they have the characters of the nihilists in that movie. And Walter, the sort of the character played by John Goodman, you can say what you want about the merits or demerits of National Socialism, but at least it's an ethos. I can at least understand it because it's actually a thing I can understand. Nihilism,
it's a thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's a thing. Whereas, because I think ultimately the nihilists and the sort of liberals are kind of in agreement in the sense that, with the liberals, it's sort of like progress will constantly happen and everything will be wonderful. And so there's no need to actually consider. But yeah, so with nihilism, it's kind of the same thing where it's ultimately it'll just lead to, political, where you become, completely, just you lose, you're impotent. You become completely impotent.
Yeah.
I think liberalism kind of breeds that too, because if you think that everything's going to be wonderful and today's the best day in the human race and tomorrow's going to be better, then it kind of breeds a certain level of impotence where you're like, well, fuck it, everything's great, so let's just not focus on it.
It's like to repeat what they say in the Citations Needed episode. It's like if you believe that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, but it does so without any work, then what are you doing? No. Like Martin Luther King, he also believed that, yes, that was the case, but he knew that it took work to do that.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And I think that's the key point. So, I think that the nihilists should really consider where they're coming from, because essentially, indirectly, they're sort of defending the status quo. And I don't think
so too.
And I don't think that there's anything wrong with trying to fight for a better world and failing. I think it's much more admirable to believe in the capacity of the future to be better and try to actively do things to be a part of that better future than just to kind of say, fuck it, and throw your hands up and just say, well, I don't have any
let it burn down.
Let it burn. I don't care.
Yeah.
Or conversely, like I said earlier, well, everything's wonderful for me, so it must be wonderful for everybody else. So I don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Just make sure you vote every 2 years, folks. And that sort of liberal hubris.
Right? If we haven't shown why that is false in the time that we've done this show.
Oh my God. Yeah.
then we've done something wrong. Like we've clearly been against that.
Voting is like the bare minimum.
Yeah.
I'm not against voting. I've voted in elections. I don't have a problem with it, but like it's the bare minimum, right? And sometimes it's harm reduction and sometimes it isn't. It just sort of depends, right?
Yeah.
When you vote for the lesser of two evil, you still vote for evil. Yeah. Unfortunately.
That you will eventually have to defeat in some way.
You will eventually have to defeat, right? And that's, and if you look at, I've talked about this before, but it's like, it's the flip side of liberalism, right? So there's some good things. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of the things that the Biden administration has done, whether it's having a better National Labor Relations Board, which has led to 200 unionizations of Starbucks in the last couple of years, which would not have happened in a Trump administration, or the massive investments in alternative energies, or there's all kinds of decent, like capping Medicare drug prices. Like there's some decent things that this era has sort of produced that will help a lot of people. Yeah. But at the same time, like there's still migrants in cages on the border. Biden, I just read this today, is like still continuing like this like barbarous policy against wild horses that the Trump administration tried to continue. Obviously, he signed off on one of the largest oil drilling projects in American history when he actively said when he was running a campaign that he wouldn't do it. Yeah. And he did it anyway.
He's still pro-cop. He's still
pro-cop. Like we went through the largest social movements in American history, Black Lives Matter 3 years ago. And we're basically we're not even at square one. We're at square -5 because now they're putting more money into cops. Yeah. So it's like, that's what I'm saying. But none of that should lead you to despair, because despair is ultimately in service of power.
Yeah, and that's right.
But it's also important not to like have like this sort of like unthinking sort of can-do optimism, because like in America, that sort of like I've talked about like that sort of toxic positivity. Mm-hmm. is like damning, because it's a denial of reality. That's why when Terry Eagleton talks about the idea of a tragic humanism, I think that's quite good, which is acknowledging that like we as humans are capable of wonderful things and we're also capable of terrible things. And just because we create a better world for ourselves and others doesn't necessarily mean that there still won't be horrible people doing horrible things.
Yeah.
Okay. And that there will be limitations to what we can and cannot do. They're just built in. Whether it's the limitations of us as a people, limitations in terms of just science, and limitations in terms of political organization, like just acknowledging those and not having a level of arrogance, because that's, I think, the bigger problem with both the sort of the fundamentalist Christians or the fundamentalist religious people, as well as the sort of like sort of new atheist types who have the sort of belief in, uppercase P, progress, and have like this view of the world that's like completely devoid of politics. This is a tease for a future episode, but basically, like in rereading God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, I am really taken aback by how truly non-political the book is. Right. For a guy who wrote about politics for most of his life, and like politics is like a big part of who he is, he's basically relatively silent on most political questions. And when it relates to like Islam,
just the intersection of politics and religion that exists throughout the world. It is quite odd that he would, like you say,
and it's kind of infantile. Like it's, and that maybe that's insulting, but it's rather like rudimentary. It's like, it's not, he doesn't go into any of the reasons why. And a lot of those guys don't. Like Dawkins, none of those guys do. Like, and also like, I think that Christopher Hitchens is like kind of the last person to lecture anybody on barbarism, as he supported the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that is one of the most like disqualifying things for him. And I very much agree with Jimmy Snow, who said that I'm glad Hitchens is dead, because then we wouldn't have to see him get worse, which is true.
Yeah.
I think he would have gotten far worse.
Mildly concerned that would have been like, because in my atheist movement days, like before he died, he was a big influence, and I kind of thought of him as a big deal. I mean, he still I didn't know a lot about his personal background, some of the misogyny that he had going on, the way that he treated people, and some of his. I didn't even know about his Iraq War stance until after he died, and then I was like, okay, this is definitely not good.
Right. And the thing is that like of the new atheists, I think he's the best one.
Right. Yeah.
I think I see where Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins exactly. Like I think Richard Dawkins is the worst. I basically think that he's like the Elmer Gantry sort of fundamentalist Christian version of atheism. I think he basically comes up with the most basic bare ass version of like critiquing God, and does it in this like hyperbolic language that is completely devoid of compassion for others.
Yeah.
Like that's the thing. Like Dawkins, I think, has no compassion for other people. Like, and I don't think that's just non-religious people. I think religious people. I think it's non-religious people.
Mm-hmm.
Like I am very disappointed to this day that the Center for Inquiry got taken over by him and by his ilk, because it's not what Paul Kurtz would have wanted, who was one of the founders of CFI, and it's not what I would have wanted as a humanist. Like I think, Dawkins is one of the worst spokespeople for our viewpoint of sort of skeptical, secular free thinking, right? And I'm very glad that the American Humanist Association, whether it was last year or the year before, revoked his Humanist of the Year award, which I'm glad they did. Because he's not a humanist. He might be an atheist, but he's not a humanist. Yeah, he's an asshole. And I think fundamentally he's a bigot, which is not surprising. I mean, he was born in colonized Kenya.
Right.
I mean, I think it tells you, I mean, he is sort of a part of that sort of effete British upper class that is not even remotely comfortable with like criticizing colonialism or racism or anything like that. I think that, and Sam Harris is the same way. I think Sam Harris might arguably be the most racist of the group. And in terms of not just his hatred of anybody who might have a shade darker than mocha, but also just black people in general. I think that Sam Harris has a contempt
his whole
for people
defense of like what's his name, Charles Murray, and like
the bell curve,
the bell curve, and and I mean he actively associates with racists. So like explicit racists, not just like people who have racial ideas that they try to pretend aren't. So,
and the problem I really have with his chapter where he talks about the new atheism is that it's essentially just a regurgitation of some of the key leaders.
Oh, geez.
And it's not like, it's just not that interesting. Like,
so where does the respectful come in of the atheism if he's
this is what I'm fucking talking about. This is what I'm fucking talking about. This is the problem I have with this book, is you call the book Respectful Atheism, and you spend mere paragraphs talking about what that would look like.
Yeah.
That's what drives me nuts, is that it is, I mean, he talks about compassion, but the chapter on compassion is literally less than 2 pages, and it's just him summarizing the 12 points of Karen Armstrong's book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. So he literally just describes what the 12 are, and sort of lays out a general overview, but then he doesn't go into like, here's where I might agree with Karen Armstrong, here's where I might disagree with Karen Armstrong, here's where I think compassion lies.
Yeah.
It's like, this book is like the opposite of the new atheism books, where like when you read Christopher Hitchens' God Is Not Great, his voice and his like moral stuff and like his moral view of the world, it's on every single page. Like, and same with Richard Dawkins, same with Sam Harris. Yeah. I have huge disagreements with all of these guys, but the one thing you can say about those books is they are written with a very specific perspective.
Yeah, with this, you can hear their voice.
You can hear their voice.
Read them or whatever.
This book doesn't have one.
Yeah. It's
a book that really should just be kind of called Atheism 101 or Atheism for Beginners.
Right.
It's I thought it was going to be so much more interesting than it is. And that's the part that I find very, very frustrating, because it's a book where I'm like, oh, this could be really cool. It's got a great title. I like the cover. It's got good blurbs on the back. Unfortunately, the blurb is from Steven Pinker, so it's not the highest praise you can get. But I thought, okay, this could be good. And I read it and I was like, it's fine. It's all right. Like, it's whatever. in that respect, it's a lot like the New Class War, where I sort of read it in a couple of days. And I was like, oh, this has a lot of good information in it. Kind of the basic things and sort of reviewing arguments for God and so forth.
Right.
But I don't care about any of that.
Yeah, which isn't that interesting, actually.
And there are better books on it, too. Like, whether it's God is Not Great, that deals with some of the God arguments, or it's A.C. Grayling's The God Argument, which is a terrific book, where the first half of the book, he basically lays out every major argument for the existence of God and critiques it. And the back half of the book, he spends basically articulating and defending his version of secular humanism. The book is terrific. You know, George H. Smith's Atheism, The Case Against God is better than this book.
Right.
You know, it's full of objectivist bullshit, but at least at least it has a perspective. It was one of those books where it's not awful. It's just not very good either. It's kind of where Michael Lynn's book is. It's like Michael Lynn's book is worse. In that this book didn't have anything in it that outwardly offended me in the way that Michael Lynn's book did. But I think that
but is offensive worse or is boring worse?
Oh God, that's a good point. I think one of the worst crimes you can do is be boring.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't necessarily rather you be offensive, but
if I find something offensive,
it's more interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because there isn't really anything in this book that's like offensive. It's not really much of a book either. It's much more of like a pamphlet of like ideas from other people that he sort of compiled together that very much reads like the notes of a college course, like a college professor. Like if I was going to teach an
atheism course,
these are my notes.
Yeah.
And instead of like the publisher going like, hey, these are interesting, but they're a little superficial. I think you should take some time to kind of flesh some of these ideas out.
Let's turn this into a real book.
And they just didn't do that.
Yeah.
So I would say for people who are sort of new to atheism, who kind of want to learn more about it, what it means, this is the book for you. Although I think there are other versions of it that are better than this book. And I've mentioned them. I think if you're going to read a book like this, I think reading A.C. Grayling's The God Argument or George H. Smith's Atheism, the Case Against God, or even Hitchens. I think those are better books to read than these are. And they're more interesting.
But if you read Hitchens, try to take away, try to be careful about what you take away from it.
If you read Hitch, I mean, the problem with Hitchens in general is that like he, and this is kind of all the new atheists in general, where they want everybody to really take they really want everybody to, I want you to think critically about your religious beliefs, but then they never ever take the minute to maybe seriously consider their own beliefs. And that's, I think, the big problem is that they sort of, like Hitchens has a quote in God is Not Great where he says, like, our belief is not a belief. Our principles are not a faith. Well, that's bullshit. Like, I mean, we do believe in things.
Yeah.
And we do have a version of faith. I mean, it's not religious faith, but it's faith in sense of like a trust or reasonable expectations based on prior events, or like,
or trust, even like trust in other people.
Trust in other human beings. Like, I have faith in you, or like I have faith that my car will get to work tomorrow. Like in
Hitchens' case, as a former Marxist, he traded in his Marxism for faith in the system.
Pretty much. and it's pretty telling. I mean, I've been very critical of Trotskyists because a lot of former Trotskyists become neocons. And Hitchens did. David Horowitz is another one. A lot of people who come out of the Trotskyist tradition either go like the CLR James route, where they become more interesting and their Marxism becomes more sort of ecumenical and influenced by anarchism and stuff, or they become like screaming rabid right-wing psychos. And
try to avoid that one.
It's the militancy. I think that's the thing is like when you read Hitchens, there's a militancy to every single page.
Yeah.
Where this book is like the complete opposite of that. And I would much rather read the militancy and have something to disagree with than to read essentially a book-length long Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
Which is what this book is. It's kind of a disappointment. And and as I've thought about it more and reviewed it for today's show, from time to time, I will go back and change my Goodreads scores of books.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, like years ago when I was a liberal and I read J.D. Vance's awful book, Hillbilly Elegy, I gave it like 3 stars or something. I was like, this book kind of sucks, but it's not horrible.
And now it's a 1.
And now it's a 1, right?
Yeah.
And like this book, I think I originally gave it a 4. I think a more accurate review is more of a 3 out of 5.
Even that book sounds generous.
I feel like it's generous because the information that is in the book is quite good, but it's like a reference text. It's like, well, I need to look up like John Gray's 7 Types of Atheism quickly. And you can just pull out the book, go to the page where he lists them all out and gives you a little summary of them. And you go, okay, now I know what this is.
Yeah.
But he doesn't take any real time to like explain his beef with them. Cause like when I got to that part of the book and I'm like, ooh, good. He's going to take John Gray to task.
Yeah. Here's something real. Yeah.
Somebody finally is writing about John Gray and is going to critique him. Wonderful. And then he just doesn't. And I find that maddening. It's like you have this opportunity to do something much more interesting than you've done. But he shines. But the thing is, true to his background as being an engineering person and a science person, the science stuff in the book is good. It's real good. It's the part where he actually has like a perspective and shares what he thinks and like, but it gets real boring with everything else. But it's, I think that I'm living. The thing is, I'm not like you. People use the term post-atheism. Mm-hmm. And I'm not like a post-atheist. Like I'm still very much like people ask me, what are you? I'm like, I'm an atheist or I'm a secular humanist.
Religiously, I'm an atheist.
Religiously, I'm an atheist. Yeah. But generally, if people ask, I'll say more than I'm a humanist. But if I'm pushed, if they want to know, I'm not going to lie to them.
Yeah.
But like, I just think that there are like, I don't know. I've read so much of this literature over the last 15 years.
Yeah.
That like, I'm just like, it's never good. It's like sometimes when you watch a movie, especially if it's a remake of a movie, and that movie reminds you of the older, better version of itself.
Right. Yeah.
So like when you watch, like, I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but like RoboCop, like the original RoboCop is like a classic sci-fi action schlock movie from the 80s. They made a remake of it a few years ago. And like, if you put like little winks in about the original movie, it just reminds me of the better version of what you're trying to do.
Right.
The Jurassic World movies are probably even better example of what I'm trying to say.
Right.
Which is, I have a hot take, which is that Jurassic Park should have never had sequels. The story of Jurassic Park is pretty much told in the first one.
Yeah.
You don't have to
recapitulate. It made too much money. You know how this goes.
Absolutely. I think Kaylee read this on the internet once, my wife, and she said, and she's right, which is that you do the first movie for art and you do the second movie for money.
Yeah.
And that's true, right?
And the third and the fourth.
Fourth and fifth and sixth. And it's like, Jurassic Park should have never had a sequel because all of the other ones basically retell the same fucking story that the first one did.
Yeah.
And the first one, so when I'm watching the newer ones, I'm just reminded, oh yeah, there's a better version of this that I could be watching right now.
Yeah.
And this book is like this, where it's like, I'm reading it and he like cites other people and I'm like, oh, that's
so I should be reading that person.
I should be reading that book or I should be reading that book.
Yeah.
Or it just reminds me of like, oh, this was better articulated in this book or like whatever. Yeah. Yeah, it's not a 1-star because it's like not insulting to my intelligence. It's not like overtly offensive. It's not like
it's not a 2 because he actually did good writing around the science
stuff and the sort of denotative versus connotative truth and like that kind of stuff. I found very interesting.
Yeah.
And
all right.
But yeah, but that's where it's average. Yeah. I'm quite generous with my reviews. Most things I read. Hot take, Jurassic Park isn't that great of a movie. That's fair. I mean, I don't necessarily think that's a crazy hot take, some random geek. I mean, I like it. I don't love it. I didn't really grow up watching it. My wife, Kaylee, did. And so I didn't watch Jurassic Park till I was like in high school.
What year did that come out?
1993.
So I was like, that was like 2 years before I graduated or was supposed to graduate.
From high school?
Yeah.
Well, I was a toddler. So that was probably before my third birthday. So I was 2.5 when that movie came out. So obviously it wasn't going to mean shit to me. But like, I watched it in high school, and I was like, "This is a good movie." Is it
Oh yeah.
Is it one of the best of Spielberg's? No, I mean it's not, but it's one of his classic ones in terms of the blockbusters. And I think the scene. I mean, I love the dinner, like the lunch scene. I was 9 when Jurassic Park came out. I didn't see it until my 20s. Yeah, it's about the same for me. And like the scene in Jurassic Park that's my favorite scene is the lunch scene where they're kind of talking. And Ian Malcolm's like, you spent all this time thinking about whether you could do it instead of you think you should do it. Yeah. And he kind of asks the moral questions and is like the only humanist in the room, making people like question whether this was a good idea or not. And like, and it's a great example of like Ian Malcolm's character is tragic humanism. Like he is basically representing like humanity's viewpoint of like, but acknowledging like this could go really, really bad. And you've not really thought through the consequences of this. And also a little bit of anti-capitalism where he goes like, you sell it, you just sell it. And like, he's like critiquing the sort of the mass marketing of it too. And John Hammond, played by the inimitable Sir Richard Attenborough, is the sort of liberal humanist who sort of is like, everything's going to be fine. I've spared no expense and it's wonderful. And, and their conversation is really interesting. And like, I could watch like a 20-minute version of that where it's just like this debate about whether or not this was a good idea or not.
Yeah.
And like the movie does great. Like the movie's a really nice build and like the visual effects are quite good. This is not a movie review show. I'm just saying like, I like Jurassic Park more than some random geek does, but I think their take is a solid take. I think its Rotten Tomato score is like a 65.
Right. So there's a significant amount
of people who are kind of like, whatever.
Yeah. I gotta admit, I'm one of those people. I think I watched it once and just it was it was forgettable for me mostly. There's some good memes and some good like you say scenes that you see, but generally.
And it does a good job, very much like his other classic blockbuster Jaws, where it doesn't show the dinosaurs all that much until the very end.
Yeah.
You do a lot of stuff where it's like you hear them or you see things that they do, but you don't see them. That's really good stuff because it's kind of builds the suspense and the tension.
Yeah.
And the newer movies don't do any of that. They just kind of, they blow their wad so early and it's boring. And or it's just a recapitulation of everything you've already seen before. And there's part of you just like, I've seen this.
Yeah, that's right.
Which brings me back to this book, which is that I've just read this before.
I've seen this. I've read this book before.
I've kind of read this book before. And it's fine. It's not awful, but it's just kind of like, it's fine. Fair. It's one of those, I read it. It goes in the bin. I take it to Half Price Books when I get rid of stuff. It's not one I'm going to keep, Certain books are ones I keep, certain ones I don't. Because I only have a certain amount of space in my house.
Yeah.
So, this was more of a freewheeling episode than last time because last time's book was much more interesting than this. And I think I just think there's more interesting ways of writing about the God debate that this person has no idea how to do. So that's it.
And while I might have disagreed with some of his perspectives, even Victor Stenger had a much better way of writing about the God debate.
Oh my God. And he was great at writing about science too.
Yeah.
Like I the one thing I will give Vic Stenger credit for is that like that dude was a badass. Like he could give a fuck what other people thought.
That's true. Yeah.
And I guess some of that's to his credit. Sometimes it probably isn't. But I liked I think I liked the passion that went into the book, Same with Christopher Hitchens. I like the passion that goes into the book. This book is passionless. It's like it just doesn't have any, it doesn't, for lack of a better way of saying it, doesn't have a soul. It's kind of soulless. It doesn't have
which I suppose would be perfect for an atheist book.
Right. It's like, it just doesn't have any, I just think like the God debate is an interesting one and its stakes are huge, right? We're talking about these guiding things, these foundational things that have guided our civilizations for thousands of years, and they clash and they butt heads, and it leads to violence and it leads to destruction. These are worth being passionate about. And it's like, you know, and it's just not passionate.
Where is it? Yeah. So.
You know, and the book ultimately doesn't even live up to its own title. It's not, you know, it's because you would think when he calls it respectful atheism that he's like being kind, like it's like trying to be
there
kind.
should be a big focus on that.
And that's not, if he kind of means that, but what he really means more is that it's respectable to other people who aren't atheists.
Mm.
And there's like a part of me that's like, okay, yes, I want people to respect me for me and respect my beliefs. But then there's the other part of me that's like, well, I could give a fuck what other people think. Like in the sense that, you know, if you're not coming with me with an interesting critique of my view, my viewpoint, then why do I care what you think?
Then I'm not going to listen. Yeah.
You know, and ultimately I don't really care what people think about what I believe. What I care more is that, do people think I'm a kind person? Do people think that I'm helpful? Do people think I'm nice? Yeah. Like those things matter a lot more, because if we're going to live in this sort of open and tolerant and sort of, you know, diverse society, which in the United States and Canada we do, I think being respectful is an incredibly important component of that. And so is tolerance.
Yeah. We have to find a way to actually let everybody have their beliefs and live together in harmony in some way, right? We have to find a way to do that.
And we have to seriously interrogate where sometimes that's not possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Where, like, you know, like Karl Popper's idea of the paradox of tolerance, where a society can become so tolerant that it tolerates intolerance.
Yeah.
And then how do you deal with a society that's become so tolerant that it tolerates intolerance, which I would argue is kind of the crisis that we face as a society now. And it's the one that Terry Eagleton articulates in his book, which is that we've become such a tolerant society that has become kind of a breeding ground for religious fanatics and cults and horrible like political movements. I mean, I don't see QAnon coming up in an authoritarian society.
No.
And that's the part that's interesting. You know, or Trumpism. Like Trumpism is authoritarian, but could only come in play in a largely sort of non-authoritarian political culture. I'm not saying that the United States doesn't have authoritarian tendencies. It absolutely does. But what I'm saying is that like the United States, our sort of shared political myth is that we're sort of this open, tolerant society.
And that, like people are allowed to have their beliefs and live among you, whether you agree with them or not. It's one of the things that QAnons will say, or like QAnon believers will say. If you criticize them, is they'll be like, well, I have a right to believe what I want. Well,
sure. And I'm not saying you don't, but at the same time, you don't have a right to shut me down when I call you a fucking idiot.
Yeah. Exactly.
And that's really like, I think that's where, like, how do we fight the paradox of tolerance? It's by articulating a viewpoint that has no, like, we can be tolerant up to a point, and then we should be not necessarily intolerant, but we should have serious critical reservations about tolerating things like QAnon or election denialism or anti-vaxxerism or, you know, or sort of anti-science religious beliefs or fascism, like, you know, and that's a really tough discussion. There is no easy answer. There is no easy solution. Hence why Popper called it the paradox of tolerance.
Yeah, that's right.
And, you know, those are interesting things to kind of talk about in relationship to religion and public life.
Yep.
That this book just ignores. And that's, I think, that's where I think it's meh, it's fine. It's whatever. It's perfectly forgettable.
Sounds good. So don't waste your time if this isn't like something you're
if you're somebody who's
interested in.
If you've read a lot of other atheist books and you're sort of in the atheist space or whatever, or you sort of consider yourself a humanist or whatever, this book's not going to give you anything you haven't already learned.
Yeah. All right. So I guess, what are we covering next time?
Next time, we will be covering Toward a Marxist Humanism by Leszek Kolakowski, the Polish philosopher. Contrary to this book, I absolutely loved this book coming up we're going to be doing. And I can't wait to talk about it, because it is in many ways the book that sort of, it kind of got me, sort of deconverted me from authoritarian Marxism and sort of Leninism. It was written in the context of the thaw after Stalin's death in the 50s. And he just writes some really, really interesting stuff in this book. And I can't wait to talk about that next time.
Very cool. I guess the only thing left now is where can people find you and your content?
People can find me at justinclark.org. That's my website. You can also find me on Instagram at justinclarkph for public history. And I have I'm working on, since this has been kind of in my mind, hence why it's in the episode, I'm working on an article for the next issue of The Truth Seeker about Christopher Hitchens and Terry Eagleton and the God debate that I think is going to be, it's really interesting. And I think that that'll be a lot more fun to kind of discuss in the future, because we're going to do a future episode where we talk about these two books from Hitchens and Eagleton. So
cool. Well, I guess that's it for us tonight. Thank you to those in the chat who joined us tonight, and thank you, Justin, for taking us through this book.
Yeah, and thank you, Cory. It's been a lot of fun.
All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me survive, which is essentially the only way that projects like this can continue for me. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticalleftist. If you can't contribute financially, then a like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check the show notes for links to all my stuff and to check out my website, skepticalleftist.com. There you can find the videos I do with my friend Damien Marie Athope, and all my old content from the Brainstorm podcast, Skeptarchy, and from my newly retired show, From Many People's Strength. You can also find links to my Discord, Reddit, and Twitch. You can contact me through my website or by emailing mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. My Twitter is @skepticallefty. My Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist, and my Mastodon is collectiva.social/@skepticalleftist. Thanks so much for listening and or watching, and make sure to leave a comment on the video or on my website. Join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda.